chapter 10. We'll start reading in verse 40. John chapter 10, starting in verse 40. He went away again across the Jordan to the place where John had been baptizing at first, and there he remained. Many came to him, and they said, John did no sign, but everything that John said about this man was true. Many believed in him there. Now a certain man was ill, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. It was Mary who anointed the Lord with ointment and wiped his feet with her hair, whose brother Lazarus was ill. So the sisters sent to him, saying, Lord, he whom you love is ill. But when Jesus heard it, he said, This illness does not lead to death, it is for the glory of God, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it. Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when he heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. Then after this, he said to the disciples, Let us go to Judea again. The disciples said to him, Rabbi, the Jews were just now seeking to stone you, and are you going there again? And Jesus answered, Are there not 12 hours in a day? If anyone walks in the day and he does not stumble, because he sees the light of this world. But if anyone walks in the night, he stumbles because the light is not in him. After saying these things, he said to them, Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I go to awaken him. The disciples said to him, Lord, if he has fallen asleep, he will recover. Now Jesus had spoken of his death, but they thought that he meant taking rest in sleep. Then Jesus told them plainly, Lazarus has died, and for your sake I am glad that I was not there, so that you may believe. But let us go to him. So Thomas, called the twin, said to his disciples, Let us also go, that we might die with him. Before we get started, I just want to ask a question before we get into the details of the text. And that is, what is the main thing that you remember about this famous story when it comes to Lazarus? If I were to say, give me the first thing that pops in your mind when it comes to the account of Lazarus, what would be the first thing that came to your mouth? He was raised from the dead. What else would you say? First thing that pops in your head.
Well, he was dead.
He was dead. Okay. Okay.
His sister said he had been in the grave long enough to stink.
Ah, yes. His sister said he'd been in the grave long enough he'd stink.
Jesus wept.
Jesus wept. Favorite Bible verse for anybody who wanted memory verses back in the day?
He tarried.
Do what?
He tarried.
He tarried. All right. Anything else? All right, we get into John chapter 11 tonight, and we have a little geography to do before we get into the text. We went over this pretty in-depth last week, but in chapter 10, verse 40, it says that Jesus left Jerusalem. In chapter 10, verse 39, what were they trying to do when he was in Jerusalem at the temple? What was this group trying to do? They were trying to stone him on the temple grounds, right in front of Solomon's porch, okay? So Jesus is leaving the hostilities of unbelief in Jerusalem and traveling to what chapter 10, verse 40 says is the place where John the Baptist was baptizing at first, or at the beginning. And we went back to the topic of John the Baptist last week a little bit. And if you go back to John chapter 1, he was the prophet who was in the wilderness. If you just summarize, he ate bugs and honey and wore camel skin and probably looked like somebody came out of the jungle after living there for 25 years. But then he started preaching about Jesus, and that is what his job was. That is what it's defined as in John chapter 1, verse 8. John the Baptist was bearing witness about the light of Jesus. That was what he did. And John the Baptist, after a while, caught the attention of the Pharisees in Jerusalem. And the Pharisees sent a delegation to John the Baptist to find out who he was. And they basically asked him a bunch of questions in John chapter 1, verse 22. And this delegation asked him, Are you Elijah? And John said, I don't know what you're talking about. And then, are you the prophet? And they ask him all these questions, and they grill him. And then John 1, verse 28 says this, that these things happened in Bethany across the Jordan where John was baptizing. So John was baptizing in Bethany across the Jordan. Now, if you see this, River Jordan right here. So across the Jordan is east of the Jordan. So Jesus went across the Jordan to where John was baptizing at first. And in the beginning of the ministry of Jesus, in Mark chapter 1, verse 9 through 11, Jesus left Galilee, which you remember Galilee was on top of Samaria, which is on top of Judea. So you got Jerusalem way down here, and you got the Samaritans, and you got the Galileans. It says that Jesus came from Galilee to be baptized of John. And if you remember, the whole thing about the baptism of Jesus is that the Holy Spirit descended upon him like a dove. A voice from heaven said, "This is my beloved Son, whom I'm well pleased." John was there, and that was where John was baptizing. Now, let me ask you a question that the text reveals to you. Where was John baptizing? By what river? The Jordan. These things happened in the Jordan River. And John the Baptist operated in the land beyond the Jordan. That's where the Pharisees went to find John the Baptist, east of the Jordan, because, once again, that was the territory that was ruled by Herod Antipas. Now, you remember this about Herod Antipas because who ultimately killed John the Baptist? Herod Antipas. Now, do you remember from last week where Herod Antipas was ruler over? He was not ruler over Judea or Samaria or anywhere near Jerusalem. Herod Antipas was ruler over two different sections. That was Perea and Galilee. So, in order for John the Baptist to be put to death, where does the guy who put him to death have to have authority? In the region that John the Baptist is in. Herod Antipas didn't have any authority whatsoever when it came to Judea. He didn't have any authority when it came to Samaria. Herod Antipas only had authority in Perea and in Galilee. So guess where John the Baptist was? He was in either Perea or Galilee when it came to the Jordan River, because that is where Herod Antipas had authority, and ultimately Herod Antipas was the one who put him to death. So there's a Bethany that is beyond the Jordan. We don't know exactly where it is. There's this vague reference down here on the map to Bethany across the Jordan. We don't know where it is. It's simply across the Jordan. So Jesus went across the Jordan. Now, what was the reception that Jesus had when he got across the Jordan? Was it good? Was it bad? Was it something that was like Jerusalem? What happened when Jesus crossed the Jordan? He was there, and many people what? Such as the beings believed. Many people believed, okay? So the text builds this tension by telling you where Jesus is, okay? When it comes to John chapter 11. The text tells you that Jesus is across the Jordan River in the area where John the Baptist is baptizing. That's east of the Jordan River. Where is Bethany that is near Jerusalem? I just told you. Where is Bethany? Near Jerusalem. That's what the text said. Bethany was near Jerusalem. There are two Bethanys in this text. There's the Bethany that is across the Jordan River, where Jesus went, where John was baptizing at first, and then there's the Bethany that is right near Jerusalem. So this text tells us that Jesus remained in Bethany across the Jordan River. Now this is some 20 to 30 miles from Jerusalem, okay? So we don't know exactly, but 20 miles is the distance between the Jordan River and the city of Bethany outside Jerusalem. That's the least distance. So from Bethany to the River Jordan is 20 miles. Now, they didn't have cars back then, okay? So if you're 20 miles away from somewhere, how long is it going to take you to get that 20 miles? I can drive the distance to my mom and dad's house, which is 26 miles. I can get there in about 26 minutes, give or take, depending on the speed limit or, yeah, you know. So you got 26 miles. Maybe take you 26 minutes to get there, right? You got 26 miles on foot. It's not going to take you 26 minutes, okay? So a day's journey at a leisurely pace, somebody would have walked either 10 or 12 miles. And that was somebody who was in good shape, not somebody that wasn't in good shape, okay? So you got somebody who's in good shape to walk 8 to 10 miles, 12 miles if you want to push it. And that was a day's journey. So you got 20 miles between Bethany and the Jordan River. How far away is Jesus? Is he a short distance away or is he a long distance away? He's a pretty long distance away. So there are two Bethanys in this text being talked about. As far as geography goes, looking at a map, the Bethany where John the Baptist was baptizing at the beginning, and that's John chapter 1, verse 28. And then there is the Bethany that we're introduced to in John chapter 11, verse 1. The Bethany outside of Jerusalem. The Bethany that is inside of Judea. And the text even tells you where this Bethany is in John chapter 11, verse 18. This Bethany is near what city? Right there in the text. Near Jerusalem. So, Bethany near Jerusalem is 20 miles to the Jordan River as a straight line goes. So we have this scene change, okay? The text builds up this tension. Jesus is across the Jordan. So Jerusalem is faded to black, okay? All of the hostilities that happened in the temple and the people wanting to stone him, that's faded to black. Jesus has gone away from the temple and away from Jerusalem across the Jordan River, and there's a multitude of believers there. And then the scene changes in John chapter 11 to some new characters. There's a certain man who was ill, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. Now we know that this town was near Jerusalem because the text says it was near Jerusalem in John chapter 11, verse 18. But to understand how near the city is to Jerusalem brings a lot of clarity to mind to all the other accounts when it comes to Bethany and the things that happened there. This city was very close to Jerusalem. If you turn to Luke chapter 24, verse 50, there's this description of where Bethany is in relationship to the Mount of Olives in Jerusalem. And what that text says in Luke 24, verse 50 is that the Mount of Olives is in the vicinity of Bethany. Now, guess where the Mount of Olives was as well? It was in the vicinity of Jerusalem. So you have the Mount of Olives being in the vicinity of Bethany and also in the vicinity of Jerusalem. So how far apart is Bethany from Jerusalem? Not very. It was what was known as a Sabbath day's journey. In the New Testament, there's only one time that phrase is used, Sabbath day's journey. All kinds of interpretations as to how long that is. But during the time of Jesus, there's a lot of people that cut it off at the 1,300-yard mark, okay? 2,000 cubits. It was all you could walk on a Sabbath day. So 2,000 cubits was all you could walk on a Sabbath day. And you could journey from Jerusalem to the Mount of Olives on a Sabbath day's journey. Now, let me ask you a question. How close is Jerusalem to Bethany? If you can go from the outskirts of Jerusalem to the outskirts of Bethany in a Sabbath day's distance, which is like 1,200 meters. How close is it? As far as distance, I want to put it to you in terms that we know. As far as distance, that is 12 football fields. Now, I know some of you wouldn't want to walk across one. I don't want to walk across one. But let's imagine there were 12 of those football fields, right? How long would it take you to walk across? Now, some of you, I understand, but would it take you 5 days to walk across 12 football fields? Probably not. It wouldn't be that great of a distance to travel, especially in Bible times, for you to walk 12 football fields. I'll give you an example. I looked on Google Earth, and from you going outside these doors, across the Joneses field where the chicken manure is, that pile out there, and you were to go across that field all the way to the 4-lane, across the Hardin Baptist Church parking lot, that is the distance that we're talking about here. So, how long would it take you to walk out those doors, across that field, down into the 4-lane, not get hit like Frogger, and then go across into the Hardin Baptist parking lot? How long would it take you to do that? Probably not a whole lot. That's the distance between Jerusalem and Bethany. Yeah.
On my map, it's 1/16 of an inch.
Oh. Thank you, Don. It's 1/16 of an inch on Don. That's not very far. Doesn't have to take very long to scoot. But the other thing is, when you think about Bethany, this on the outskirts of Bethany is where Jesus is going to take his disciples 40 days after his resurrection from the dead. And right outside of Bethany is where the disciples are going to see Jesus ascend into the heavens. And the angel appears and said, in the same way that you see the Son of Man leave, you will see him come again. That happened outside in the outskirts of Bethany. That happened right outside the Mount of Olives. There's even prophecies concerning Bethany in Zechariah chapter 14, verse 4, where it says, on that day, his feet shall stand on the Mount of Olives that lies east of Jerusalem, talking about the very thing that we just went over in Luke chapter 24. He will ascend into the heavens from the Mount of Olives, which is on the outskirts of Bethany. I found that very interesting that Lazarus and his resurrection from the dead, the same place where that happened is the place where Jesus ascended. Now, once again, the city's not very far from Jerusalem, less than a Sabbath day's journey, less than a half-a-mile walk. If you were to go on a leisurely stroll, you could probably get there within a few minutes. Now, this village on the outside of Jerusalem, the characters in this story, remember, Jesus is where? When it comes to John chapter 11, where's Jesus? He is not in Jerusalem or in Bethany. Where's he at? He's across the Jordan River. So he's nowhere near Bethany. So, the Bible tells us and builds this tension in the text. Jesus is not anywhere near Bethany. So what happened to Lazarus? Lazarus got sick, okay? So let's learn about what the text says about these real-life characters, these real-life friends of Jesus. So there was Lazarus. He was sick. That word for sick is the Greek word asthenes. Now, if you remember anything about the word studies we've done, if you have a at the beginning of any Greek word, it's like having un at the beginning of any English word. It means without. So if you have an a at the beginning of any Greek word, that means without something, and then the rest of the word is what it's without. So when it comes to this word, it means without health or without strength. Or in the medical field, I don't know if you've ever heard of this term, Ben, or anybody else in the medical field, asthenia. You ever heard that before? It's an old term. No? Don't ever? Oh, okay. Asthenia is when someone is sickly, lacking strength, immobile because of disease. So a weakness caused by disease that causes someone to become immobile. The other thing about Lazarus, not only is he sick, but the other thing about Lazarus that we have to know about in this text is that Jesus loved Lazarus. And Lazarus was a very close friend of Jesus. And this friendship existed long before Lazarus became sick. Matter of fact, in the ministry of Jesus in the Gospels, you will not find any other person besides Lazarus specified by the title of friend of Jesus. For you to be called the friend of Jesus, that would have been a life that was worthy of imitating if Jesus called you his friend. I understand he calls us his friends. I understand that. But this is a title that is given, that Jesus was his friend. And this wasn't just a casual acquaintance. Jesus loved Lazarus. And it's evident by the fact of that very short verse in John chapter 11 that we all know and that we all love when it came to Sunday school. Jesus wept. And when he wept for Lazarus, in John chapter 11, verse 36, the very next verse, they said, those who saw Jesus weep said, see how he loved him. So Jesus wept over Lazarus. They were good friends. Now you probably have some friend in your life where you will cry when they're gone. And that kind of kinship is very special indeed. So this is a scene where a very sick Lazarus is a friend whom Jesus loved. And Lazarus was not just a friend to Jesus. If you remember the text we went over and that we just read in John 11, verse 11, Jesus was not just a friend of Lazarus. The disciples were a friend of Lazarus because Jesus said to the disciples, our friend Lazarus. Then there's the rest of the family whom Jesus also loved. There's Mary and her sister Martha. Now this family in Bethany has been a constant comfort and peace for Jesus whenever he's in the region. Remember, Bethany is not far away from Jerusalem, but it's kind of like getting out of the city and going to like a countryside a bed and breakfast, you know. This family was a home. And there was warmth there, and there was friendship there, and Jesus loved this family and loved the people in this family. And this was shown the first time that we see on the pages of the Gospels when Jesus is described as going to the home of Martha in Luke chapter 10. There were 3 times that Jesus went to the house of Martha, the house of Lazarus. In Luke chapter 10, verse 39 and following, in John chapter 11, the text we're going over, and then in John chapter 12. There were 3 different times that Jesus went to the home of Lazarus. And when we come to the home of Lazarus, we see Martha doing what? You remember the story. She's cooking, she's cleaning, she's doing all this work, she's laboring. She makes the best meal possible. She makes the home as presentable as it could possibly be. And in Luke 10:38, Jesus is welcomed into the home. And then Martha is described as being distracted and concerned while all the serving was going on. And to me, Martha's like my grandmother on Thanksgiving. All right, when I was a kid and my grandmother at Thanksgiving, she was throwing food on the table like she was slopping hogs, okay? There would be all this plate that was done. She'd go over there and she'd slap some more on there and she'd ask if you need refills and she'd go refill everything and she'd get some more stuff out of the fridge, say you need something else and go get a utensil. And she was moving around all the time when it came to growing up. She was just moving and moving and working and working. And I'm sure you have people like that when it comes to your life as well. And as soon as, supper was done, Thanksgiving dinner was done, she'd get the dessert, she'd clean off the table, make room for all the dessert. She'd get fresh forks and plates and then she'd clean up the dishes and we'd go in the living room and I wouldn't see her for the rest of the night because she'd be cleaning up in the kitchen the whole time. She just go the entire time. That's what Martha is in this text. And Jesus loved this home and all the people in it. And in the next chapter, after Lazarus is raised, Jesus visited this home again, okay? So you got Luke chapter 10, you got John chapter 11, you got John chapter 12. 3 times in the gospel accounts we're told that Jesus came to this home and stayed with Mary and Martha. But we get this idea about Martha's house, that she was a woman of means. She had some kind of wealth, or Lazarus did, or someone did when it came to the family, because she was constantly hosting people in her home. Now, you also know, how many of the apostles were there? There's 12, okay? So, not only were there 12 apostles, there were also an entourage following after Jesus wherever he went, of women especially. So you have all these people that are following Jesus, and apparently whenever Jesus went to Bethany, he had at least the apostles with him. But all of these people in this house were near and dear to the heart of Jesus. And Jesus was very near and dear to them. This was a resting place for him. This was a charging station for him. Because his house was filled with love and service and people having compassion. And Jesus loved all of them. And the disciples were even the ones who loved them as well. They were his friends, or the disciples were their friends. So during all these hostilities that Jesus is going to go through and has gone through when it comes to Jerusalem, Bethany was like an oasis. All the stuff he was going through in Jerusalem, he could always go to Bethany. This place of quiet rest. And when Lazarus grew sick, the house knew where to go to for help and comfort. Because when Lazarus got sick, what was the first thing they did? They called for Jesus. They wanted their brother Lazarus to be known to Jesus. So they appealed to that love that Jesus had for Lazarus. The sisters sent to him saying, "Lord, he whom you love is ill." And you can imagine that the home that was once bustling with all type of food being prepared and all types of things being, service being given, the home of Martha is now nursing the health of their beloved brother. And the scene ends there in the home with sisters sending the message, whether it's by messenger or whether it's by written, we don't know. It was a message that was sent to Jesus. Please come and heal our brother. And the scene changes because the message reaches Jesus. And where is Jesus not? He is not in Bethany outside Jerusalem. The message reaches Jesus, but where is Jesus at? On the other side of the Jordan, or the least that we know is that he is no longer in Judea. He is not even in the region of Judea. More than likely, as the text said, he was across the Jordan where John was baptizing at the beginning. It would have taken at least 2 days to get that message to Jesus. To get the message to Jesus. So Lazarus is sick. Jesus is 2 days away across the Jordan River. So the message was sent. 2 days later, it gets to Jesus. The message is received. Lazarus, whom you love, is sick. And when Jesus hears this message, the disciples are with him. Now, there's always a teaching moment when it comes to the disciples. As soon as they hear something, it's probably their faces are like, I don't know what that is. So, they hear Lazarus is sick. Please come heal him. And there are parallels and connections like crazy to the conversation that we had in John chapter 9 when it came to the man that was born blind. We went over the man born blind for like 2 months. So the disciples in John chapter 9, when they see the man that was born blind, do you remember what they asked Jesus? Because they thought they already knew the answer to the question. What did they ask Jesus? Who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born like that? Obviously, they were wrong because Jesus corrected them when it came to their wrong thinking. They believed that the illness, the sickness, this blindness was because of some sin that this man committed or some sin that his parents committed. Now, the message said Lazarus is sick. And I'm sure the same thought went through the apostles' mind, just like the same thought went through the apostles' mind when they saw the blind man. What did he do? Because that was the culture of the Jews. If you go back and you look at the culture we went over, as soon as something bad happened, it was because you did something that God was going to punish you for. We even went back to talking about the Tower of Siloam with Jesus, because he even exposed this thought in their culture, that because the tower fell, they were greater sinners than the rest of the people that were around that survived the tower falling. And Jesus said, that's not the case. So the disciples have the exact same concept when it comes to their brain. Well, let's see. This man's born blind. He must have sinned or his parents did. So when they hear that Lazarus is sick, maybe even unto death, what are they going to have in their brain? It hadn't flipped the switch yet because it's only been 2 chapters. First thing that's going to come into their mind is what they've been taught. And that is, if you're sick, if you're dying, if you're afflicted, you've done something to mess up your relationship with God. And it's totally false. Because Jesus answers in the exact same way. There's an exact parallel to what Jesus said about the blind man being born blind. You remember what the answer was that Jesus said? This man didn't sin, his parents didn't sin, but he was born that way to what? For the glory of God. Guess what Jesus says to the same group of disciples? You got to know they're thinking, well, what did Lazarus do? And Jesus is going to be like, no, you got the wrong thought again. Because what was the answer that Jesus gave? Remember, this is a message that was said out loud. Lazarus is sick. Come help him. And this is what it said. This illness does not lead to death. It is for the glory of God, so that the Son of God might be glorified through it. Do you see the connection? Who is he talking to? He's talking to the apostles again. He's talking to the disciples again. The parallel goes further, because in chapter 9, verse 4 and 5, Jesus goes on. When he's talking about the blind man, he says, we must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. I am the light of the world. And Jesus uses almost the exact same language when it comes to describing what's going to happen with Lazarus. Are there not 12 hours of light in the day? If anyone walks in the day, he sees the light of the world. Guess what? Jesus was going to show them the light. And the light was going to show them who he was. So probably 2 days for the message to get to Jesus from Martha and Mary. Then Jesus says, let us go to Judea again. Now, you have to pay attention to that statement. Because if he said, let us go to Judea, where was he not? He's not in Judea. He's not in Judea. He's got 2 more days of a journey to get to Bethany outside Jerusalem. And we'll talk about what happens when he gets there, okay? But there are 4 things that I kind of want to discuss for the rest of the time. I guess you can call them lessons that we can expand on when it comes to discussion, however you want to do it. The first one is this: a loving home does not go unnoticed. How many of you have noticed that when it comes to you coming into a house, you coming into a family, and you notice how much they care and have concern for and love you? I'll ask you the negative. How many of you have gone to a church before where the opposite was true? Where no one even saw you, spoke to you, took time to talk to you? So one of the big things that I know from this text is that when you went into the house of Lazarus, Martha, and Mary, you were going to be shown love, concern, and care. Anybody want to expand on that? Oh man, it's going to be a long... All right, number 2. We'll go back over these. Number 2. The question that came up with me is, where do I go in the greatest time of need? The greatest need for Mary and Martha was for their brother. But they also knew the greatest need, or the greatest source that could meet that need was Jesus. They knew that there was a need when it came to their brother, but they couldn't supply that need, so they went to Jesus. So where is it that you go in the time of your greatest need? What is it that you place your trust in, your faith in, your all in when it comes to everything? And the answer is always Jesus, but is it truly the answer for you? I only got 2 more. If somebody's going to start talking, we're going to... You go, what? Oh.
And then I go in the living room and I get it clean and I think, I didn't know to do this last night. I better do that now. So that's what I do.
Well, that's good. I didn't know what you were saying. All I heard was you rolled all over your house. And I was like, did Don not come and help? Because you remember rolling down the parking lot. Does everybody remember that story? Do you want me to tell it again? I will. Well, this was like it was not long after you got here. Right away. Dawn and Carmen were right down here, okay? And she was in a wheelchair and it had a brake on it, right? And then the brake somehow did not get set. And you know how the parking lot slopes. So I'm talking to Dawn, and all of a sudden, Carmen starts rolling right past us. Nobody behind her, nothing. And I'm looking at Dawn going, there goes Carmen. I was like, there goes Carmen. In my mind, I was like, should I do something? Because I really didn't know what to do. And she ended up going all the way down to the berm of dirt down there. And I remember, I could see it in clear as my mind. You know how you think of things in the video? She got all the way down to the bottom, and I saw her go like this. Because I thought she was going over for sure. But I did. I stood there, just in shock, because I didn't know what to do. I was looking at Don, he's looking at me. There's nothing I can do. She's already like halfway down there. Might as well start videoing. I'm just joking. But that was like the first time. It was great. I mean, not for her. It was one of those stories that I'll never forget. Never forget. So. All right, number 3. Those who love the Lord and those whom the Lord loves are not immune from sickness, pain, or death. I mean, the text tells you Jesus loved Lazarus. But what was Lazarus going through? He was going through some sickness and some ailments, and even to the point of death. So just because the Lord loves me, loves you, does not mean that I'm immune from affliction or pain or persecution in this life, for sure. And number 4, no matter where Jesus is, because as we've gone over, Jesus is not in Jerusalem, Bethany, anywhere near. Wherever Jesus is, he knows what is happening to those who are his. He already knows what's happened to Lazarus. Even before he dies, he already knows what's going to happen. And he knows what's happening with you. He knows what's happening with me. Even as he looks down from heaven to earth, he knows everything about you and everything about me. What about you? What did you learn so far when it comes to this text? I know we haven't gone over the resurrection part. We will next time. There's a lot to talk about when it comes to resurrection. Fact number 1.
That family loving, welcome people. Today, God's family is the church.
Yeah.
We must welcome newcomers, strangers, friends. We must be welcome in the church, just like that.
Anybody else? You're going to wait for Jerry? All right. We'll talk more about Lazarus and his raising and next week. So read the rest of John chapter 11.